Hello everyone, welcome to another Shmup topic video. Today I'm discussing the difference between playing fighting games competitively and playing Shmups competitively, both within and out of the game. And I have to say that even though I am comparing them and saying versus in the title and all that stuff, I think the two genres are complementary to one another. I think playing Shmups competitively gives you something that fighting games don't deliver, and also the other way around, playing fighting games competitively gives you something that shmups don't deliver. I think more players have a lot of crossover between the two, especially on the shmup side, and by no means am I trying to say one is better than the other, because I love them both, and I just want to kind of give a overall summary of my different experiences between the two and why I find the differences interesting and how they test different parts of me and how they can help improve one another, right? Like getting good at shmups may make you a little bit better at fighting games and the other way around. And so the first difference that I want to comment on, which is pretty obvious but also very fundamental and important to talk about, is the difference in competitive environment between the two, where shmups take place in a parallel competitive environment and fighting games take place in a head-to-head competitive environment. So in a head-to-head environment, you're interacting with your opponent directly in a discrete amount of time. This is the only amount of time that matters. The outcome of the match is all that matters. What happened before doesn't apply. What happens after doesn't apply. All that matters is what is happening in the moment. Whereas with shmups, because you are interacting on parallel, you're not directly facing your opponent. I know there are some shmups that kind of break this rule, right? Like Twinkle Star Sprites, and there's a Toho shmup and stuff. But I'm not talking about those, and even those you're not directly interacting with your opponent. You're like still sort of parallel, you're just playing at the same time with little influences you have over one another. And I do think there is a shmup, a Toho one, where you are literally just shooting each other and stuff like that. It's like an arena type thing. But for the most part, I'm obviously talking about the traditional shmup, right? Your Grega, your DDP, your DOJ, all that sort of thing. And with shmups that are taking place parallel to one another, you're actually competing against your opponent's personal best, right? You're not fighting them one-on-one in real time. And because of that, the relationship between the players and their scores is actually extremely different than with fighting games. So some examples from fighting games that are obvious and recent, at least if you follow fighting games, is something in Melee. Armada recently retired. And what's interesting about fighting games is when a great player retires, that impacts all the other players around them immediately, right? So the next tournament, that player that was getting second now has a much better chance of getting first. They no longer have to worry about this player being there. They're basically vanished from the competitive landscape. Yes, they have a history when you look back and you do like, oh, who was the greatest player of all time thing. But as far as the competitive landscape that you are interacting with at the moment, they no longer exist. They are gone. Whereas with shmups, that is not really the case. For instance, WTN, the world record holder for Donpachi, could quit playing shmups today. He could just quit. I'm never playing shmups again. I'm never playing Donpachi again. That wouldn't really matter from a competitive landscape for the most part. It kind of does for the future part. But as far as the present, that makes no difference. You still have to beat his score in order to beat him. You still have to beat his record, even if he isn't actively playing anymore. So with shmups, you're competing against players across all time. You're competing against players of the past, you're competing against players now, and you're competing against players in the future, right? Where let's say you beat WTN, yes, I did it. I now hold the Dodonpachi world record. There's also future generations of shmup players who could arise and beat your score, which is pretty crazy. And that doesn't happen with fighting games, right? Where you win Evo 2016, it's not like the guy from 2018 can show up the next day and be like, okay, we're fighting this out. Put your Evo trophy on the line. I'll win it and I'll win Evo 2016, right? That's not how it works. And so that is a huge difference. And also, I think it affects the psychology of fighting games players and shmup players quite a bit. But we'll get into that a little bit later on. The other thing that's a big difference between the two is what skill sets the two genres test. And when I say skill sets, I don't mean in-game skill sets, because obviously in-game skill sets are very different. I'm talking about sort of meta skill sets that good players have across the genres. For instance, in fighting games, some meta type skill sets that you have across all fighting games is your ability to read opponents, your ability to intimidate opponents, your ability to make adaptations on the fly, your ability to understand weaknesses in their game plan on the fly, your ability to keep cool under pressure and execute when all the stakes are happening in that moment, and your ability to be consistent and know the min max of, okay, this is less consistent but it's a big reward, or it's more consistent but less rewarding, and knowing when to apply those types of strategies. That's all very meta. With shmups, that's not as much of a case. There are some of those things that carry over, like the whole this is more consistent but less risky, or this is more risky but less, or more rewarding but less consistent. You do apply that with shmup, but there comes a point in shmups too where you have to make that step forward and say, okay, I need to make this happen. Whereas in fighting games, that could arise, but it also could not arise, right? Just depending on the competitive landscape, right? And so another thing with shmups that is a big difference in your ability is you cannot psychologically intimidate your shmup. Unfortunately, I wish that would apply. I wish I could psych out hibachi or read hibachi and all that sort of thing. And when I say read, I mean read the psychology, not read within the game of being able to see the patterns really quickly and stuff like that. And so in the place of being able to psych out your opponent, a new skill set arises in shmups that isn't quite the same thing in fighting games, which is the ability to endure mental punishment. So in fighting games, you could say, you have your mental guard broke or stuff like that when you get totally discouraged by your opponent, totally crushed by them, and you basically give up and rage quit and throw your controller and stuff like that. Yeah, that's a thing in fighting games, but the time frame in which that happens in fighting games is usually 10 minutes at the most, right? Whereas in shmups, hours, days, weeks, months, years. The time frame of mental punishment in shmups is much longer than in fighting games, and it is much more heavily tested. You grind out run after run after run. You get to 35-minute mark, you die. In Dodonpachi especially, you drop your chain, you bomb, you die, you lose your max bonus. You gotta reset. Fighting games don't really have reset syndrome necessarily, or they shouldn't. They shouldn't have reset syndrome unless you're being a rage quitter or something like that. And so that is a totally different skill set in shmups that does not really arise in fighting games. Sometimes in fighting games, you need that mental fortitude to practice in training mode, to practice your combos and all that sort of thing. That's kind of like doing save state practice in shmups. But there comes a point in shmups where you have to execute that over long periods of time. Another thing that shmups reward much more heavily than fighting games is creativity, where let's say in fighting games you come up with some creative strategies. Once in a blue moon you can come up with a creative strategy that breaks the game, like Korean backdashing or wave dashing or something like that. But even then, your opponents are going to pick up on that and it's going to become part of the meta. Whereas with shmups, it's much more finding creative new ways to route, finding creative new ways to break the game, and being able to break the game and understand the underlying game mechanics. That is a much more rewarding ability to have in shmups than it is in fighting games. For instance, there are many fighting game players who are known as like lab monsters that are very good at finding exploits, finding problems, finding ways to extend the combos. Lab monsters, right? There's even a term for it. Those people are rarely the best players in the world, though. Those people are rarely, because the other skill set of being able to read your opponents and execute and be cool under pressure, the Daigo full parry moment type stuff, that usually is what makes a champion in a fighting game, more than the people The lab monsters help the meta, but they don't necessarily always push as the best players. There are exceptions, but usually that's not the case. With Shmups, that is the case. If you know how to break the Shmup and you're able to execute that and you're able to break down the underlying game mechanics, you are a Jamers, you are a Kiwi, you are a great player. That does translate into high scores, WTN, right? People who can do that, create effective routes. Of course, being the complete package in both cases is best, but one is more heavily rewarded than the other, right? In Shmups, that is rewarded heavily. In fighting games, it's rewarded okay-ish, but not as heavily. Whereas for me, my strength in fighting games that helps me win lots of matches in fighting games is my clutchness. I'm a very clutch player. It's just something I'm able to do. I'm able to keep cool under pressure. Sometimes when my opponent is beating me, I actually gain like a power boost. I get better because I thrive off my opponent's confidence. I was like, oh, they think they know what they're doing, and I switch up my game plan and get under their skin. I'm able to do that pretty well in fighting games. With Shmups, being able to be clutch, of course, when you're dodging like the final attack in Dodonpachi, that got me through it. My clutch does help me in Shmups, but being able to clutch dodge stuff and all that sort of thing just doesn't get you that far in Shmups because Shmups are designed to crush your soul, right? So in Dodonpachi is a great example of this. You make like 5 clutch dodges, besides certain patterns, let's say like in a stage, it just keeps piling on because you get off route. And so one mistake is punished with another mistake, which is punished with another mistake. And so that it's less rewarded in Shmup. So there's your trade-off there. And so let's talk now about improving at fighting games versus improving at Shmups. So improving at Shmups and fighting games is actually a pretty similar process, to be honest. It's just what they require is a little bit different. So with Shmups, what you really need is you need access to strong replays. That's like the #1 tool. And of course, a strong sort of way to play the game, right? Not a laggy port with no stage select, right? Like a solid emulator with save states, load states, maybe even some slowdown, rewind features. And of course, able to analyze replays, the best replays around. Those are all ingredients. And then having sort of a peer group of players that can advise you and tell you, oh, with this thing, and analyze your replays and all that sort of thing. That's the ingredient of being a great Shmup player. None of that really requires in-person interaction. Now, Japan is the best Shmup region, hands down, and they have a lot of in-person interaction. So I do think having that in-person interaction provides a lot of motivation, provides a lot of strength, but it is possible to get insane scores without that, right? There are famous examples of Shmup players like Leos for Dodonpachi, and also even our great Western players, right? Many of them don't really have much interaction because we're so geographically spread out from each other. With fighting games, you need direct interaction, and it is absolutely necessary. You can't be a lone wolf fighting game player. That is a huge difference between the two. Shmups, you can be a lone wolf player. It is possible. It'll be harder, but it is possible. With fighting games, that's really not the case. You have to have access to fellow players. You need to have that slow grind upward, whether you're going to locals and then you're going to, the bigger locals, and then you end up going to majors and all that sort of thing. You need all of that. So fighting games, being good at a fighting game is extremely dependent on your access to competition, on your access to fellow players. With Shmups, that is much, much easier problem to solve. So this is a positive for Shmups. We're not only, again, because you're competing across all time. So you could watch a replay. I have one on my channel from way early when Dodonpachi came out and learn from it and improve and have a lot of skill sets to really have some top level. Like if I just had that one replay, I could technically get the Western record by following what it does, right? The Western CS record, right? Or even higher. The replay, I'll link the replay of what I'm talking about. Um, but with fighting games, that's really not the case. You can have thousands of Daigo videos from the past, and those all can be useful, but you need that direct interaction between other players. And so the difference is that shmups don't ever truly die competitively, where fighting games die competitively all the time, right? My local Melee scene has died off. I can still play online and still go to larger tournaments, but I can no longer compete at a local level. It's just not going to happen. Where shmups, Donpachi ain't going anywhere. Those scores aren't going anywhere. So that is a huge benefit of shmups. The flip side to that is because fighting games demand this sort of competitive cross-play between players, this interaction. Fighting games tend to be much more community-driven. You also tend to get much better social interaction picking up fighting games. Motivation is stronger in fighting games too. You are more motivated to play a fighting game than you are to play a shmup, and in a competitive sense, for the most part. There are exceptions, but for the most part, having that direct competition and stuff, having people right there, being a resource not only to yourself but to your fellow players, makes people hang around fighting games much longer than shmups, right? Shmups have a tendency to burn through players pretty well, and people can get discouraged, and it's a little bit, when you look at the competitive player base of shmup, it's much smaller, and I think that's one reason for it, among others. Another interesting difference between the two, which seems kind of weird to bring up, but this is why I'm making this video, because it's kind of interesting about, is the role of RNG in shmups and fighting games. And of course you can sit and think, and I'm talking about both in-game without a game, because this is very interesting. In shmups, you can have a very RNG heavy shmup, right? Like Battle Rega, all these other, RNG heavy shmup. Donpachi has its own fair share of RNG, honestly. But in my opinion, unless the shmup has absurd levels of RNG that I've never seen before, I would actually say that shmups are much more consistent competitive experience than a fighting game, because fighting games have the ultimate RNG. It's called reality, and I'm talking, when you're playing competitive fighting games, the brackets, who shows up, who gets sick, who retires, who feels sad, who feels confident, all those types of things are massive levels of RNG in fighting games. So I think fighting games, in their nature of competitive, because they're not this across all time, you playing at your best, you having all these different chances, fighting games are extremely RNG heavy as far as competitiveness, right? You go to the tournament, your car breaks down, you miss your pool or whatever, you lost. All those types of things. So fighting games are full of RNG on a competitive sense, because reality dictates, because it's that direct head-to-head competition thing, reality dictates a lot of what goes on more than actually just your in-game control. So that is something to think about as well. That's pretty interesting, which makes it possible sometimes for lesser players to win larger tournaments, and also for great players to lose large tournaments, right? The RNG factor of fighting games is very powerful, especially when you start playing a fighting game with a lot of sort of RNG-ish elements within the game too, for like Street Fighter V, right? Street Fighter V doesn't have technical RNG, but especially early, I think it's changed, but early on Street Fighter V was so hectic and wild that it was like, it felt very random at times. Another big difference between shmups and fighting games, that I've talked about this a little bit, is the difference in motivation, right? In shmups, it is possible to be motivated by saltiness and by people like talking smack on you and stuff like that, but it's less powerful of a motivator than it is with fighting games. So I would say a very basic way to say this is, shmups tend to have much more positive, affirming motivation, and fighting games tend to have more negative, confrontational source of motivation as far as what's strong, right? Of course, there's examples of both in each, but I got good at Melee because people were talking shit on me and I wanted to beat them, and that really pushed me. Yeah, people in my local scene were total douches, and I did end up beating them, and it felt amazing. And then with Shmups, right, someone could talk shit on you and be like, "Oh, you suck. You don't have 600 mil. 600 mils free or whatever." But at the same time, it's like, okay, it's just 500 hours later, 600 hours later, it's like saltiness does not persist 600 hours on, right? And which is another interesting thing to look at, because fighting game players have a much higher tendency to be salty, to be angry, to explode, throw their arcade sticks. And I feel like shmup players are much more likely to be depressed and sad, right? Like when you look at shmup players, sometimes they'll get a great record and still kind of be sad about it, or they always feel a little bit more insecure, right? And fighting game players are usually more boastful and arrogant. Shmup players are usually more sad, depressed, insecure as far as what the game does to you, right? Even with me, like for instance, I get my Dononpachi 2-all, and for a few weeks I feel like, hell yeah, I'm awesome. And then you start looking around you and you start seeing players getting higher scores and you see how far you still have to go. Insecure, like I still feel kind of insecure about my 2-all because at the time it seemed like an inhuman feat, but now that I've gotten further in the genre, it's like, well, 2-all isn't enough. I need a higher score now. And it's like, okay, and I know there's going to come a point where I'm going to feel like, okay, I need to get a 600 mil. Then I know Jamers or someone with a 600 mil, I know deep down they're like, well, it's not a 700 mil though. It's not a world record. So that insecurity, I think, is much more, because there's always further to go, right? With shmups, you can always go further. Whereas with fighting games, you could literally just reach your end in fighting games, where you don't want to invest your life in being a competitive player. You don't want to invest you literally can't. So you're just the best in your local scene and you kind of reached your peak and there's no insecurity there. You're like, okay, I'm the best here and I'm never going to really compete with anyone who can challenge me. But at the same time, I'm not going to change my career and become a professional player or anything. So you can hit ceilings in fighting games much earlier on than in shmups, where you can't hit the ceiling really. And so that can be a secure feeling, but it's also a little bit more artificial, right? So that's something that's very interesting between the two. And so I've gone on long enough, but let me finish by sort of talking about some various pros and cons of playing fighting games and shmups, right? So the biggest con of fighting games is that fighting games die. Your game can literally expire. You can get really good at a game. Like, I got fairly good at Street Fighter 4. Not really good, but I got fairly good at Street Fighter 4. Of course, you can carry those skills into Street Fighter 5, but if you don't like Street Fighter 5, that skill set dissipates and disappears. That doesn't happen, right? Because in Dononpachi, you just can keep going, right? And people can keep competing. It's not like DOJ comes out and you're like, okay, no one play Dononpachi anymore. We're done with that game. We all play DOJ now. Imagine that. And we all only play SDOJ or something like that because, yeah, so that doesn't happen in Shmup. Once the game is a valid competitive game, it will continue to be a valid competitive game in Shmup, which is a huge, huge plus. Another big challenge of fighting games, which is improving though, is online gameplay and playing remotely, right? Where lag, thanks to rollback and higher internet speeds and stuff, this problem is diminishing, but it will always be a problem. This is not a problem in shmups, right? Someone could have shit internet, as long as they can record their gameplay and upload it. It doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. Same thing with like streaming and all that sort of thing. All that matters is you and the game, and that's it. So there, you don't have that whole lag issue and stuff like that. You can have in-game lag, like the Psycho on Switch, but there is no input lag with online competitive gaming and stuff like that, which is really nice. Another thing about fighting games that can be a little bit frustrating is when you fall in love with a fighting game, there's not a player base for it. Like, there's some fighting games that I really like that I think would be fun to play competitively, but you literally can't because there's not enough player base. Like, Last Blade on Neo Geo seems like an awesome fighting game, but no one plays it competitively, of course. Super Street Fighter 2, the new challengers, the Super Nintendo version. So my favorite version of Street Fighter 2 is actually the Super Nintendo version. I'll make some various reasons for it, but I just like it has a little bit more input leniency, and I actually like that it doesn't have supers and stuff like that. But no one plays that version, right? Everyone plays Super Turbo, the final arcade version. So besides me and my brother, another thing that's kind of a con about fighting games is there's a lot of drama and negativity between different fighting game scenes, right? And the reason for that is because they're fighting for player base, right? The game with the biggest player base wins, right? So for instance, I like Dead or Alive, but like people who play Tekken, people who play Street Fighter, stuff like that, will look down on Dead or Alive and say, oh, this game's stupid. Melee, of course, everyone hates on Melee, and still Melee continues on. You can hate all you want, you can't stop it. And the reason for that, like I said, is because they're competing for players. This doesn't really happen in Shmups with one exception. The big exception is the beef between Toho and the arcade scene, which is kind of like a beef between Melee and the FGC or something like that, right? Maybe that's why I want more unity, right? Because I do see how lame that is when it happens. But for the most part, you don't have that beef between, oh, I play Battle Grega, well, I play Dononpachi, okay, well, you suck, and all that. I mean, people can say that kind of stuff in jest, of course, but I don't think anyone means it deep down. And because your skill set translates between shmups so well, even shmups that are pretty different from each other, it's not really an issue, right? The overall player base, of course, it can happen from time to time, it can, but it's just a lot less toxic and a lot less exaggerated than with fighting games, which is a plus. But let's talk about the negatives of playing shmups competitively. It's not how I want to end the video, but it's also really deep in the video, so maybe you'll never get this far. But some things that I think fighting games are better and more fun than playing shmups competitively. The first is that shmup players tend to not really be that competitive in the first place, so that can be kind of an issue, right? Where you play a shmup like Danmaku Limited 3, and me and Pazzy seem to be the only people playing it, and Pazzy quit, and he never uploaded a replay of his PB, and so it's just me, right? Stuff like that, where there's just not that player base, and there's not that, but it's not like those people don't exist either. It's just that people don't have the drive to play competitively in shmups nearly as much as they do in fighting games, of course. It's less inherently competitive. Also, shmup events will just never quite measure up to fighting game events because that real-time drama is so high, and the feeling of winning a tournament, there's nothing that quite compares to it. Even beating a PB, I am sure, getting the 2-all felt awesome. But the difference is, like I said, with the shmup, even when you get your PB or you break a record or something, you still can see how far you could go. And it could always be erased in the future, right? There's that insecurity of your score. That doesn't happen with fighting games. You win the tournament, you can't unwin the tournament, right? You can't unwin your Evo trophy, right? But in shmups, you could literally lose your world record and then it's gone. So that is a bit of a con with shmups, and I have this fear very often when someone new comes and picks up Dononpachi. I'm like, oh, let me beat Airpost score before you beat it, right? So that is a little bit of a con with playing shmups competitively. And of course, there's like the community type of things where we don't really have a solid leaderboard and all that sort of stuff, but that's all in the works. The leaderboard is coming. It's gonna be delayed a little bit just because of my circumstances, where normally I'd work on it because of life and stuff. It's just a little bit delayed. That's all. So anyway, let me end this video by thanking my patrons. So thank you to Dingo, Andycapped, Anthony A, Ben Win, Corio, Eric H, Full Set, Retro Schmupper, Houseu, Kiwi, JB RPG, Joe Angelo, Gameboy Guru, K, Malaise, Mark Toms, Martin Laurel, Maz, Meher Calendrian, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, and Electron, Okla Kugel, Smacky Factor, Segumo, Plasmo, and Utakaya. Thanks for watching.